Hello, dear ones. Father Peter John coming to you from the Metropolitan Philip Auditorium at the Antiochian Village Conference and Retreat Center. Christ is in our midst. Today we heard some beautiful hymns during Matins for the saints that we celebrate today, namely John and Symeon, the Fool for Christ of Edessa in Syria. These men took a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and they were so moved by their trip to Jerusalem that they decided to dedicate themselves completely to Christ in the monastic life. And so they were tonsured monks, and they went to go live in the wilderness around the Dead Sea. Interestingly, I've been to the Dead Sea. If you're not familiar with the Dead Sea, you know there's so much salt in it, you can float in it. You actually can't sink. You try to, if you go sit in the water, you sit on the water. It's really spectacular. Well, so they lived out there in the wilderness around the Dead Sea. Lots of great geckos, actually, in that area. True story. Anyway, so there they are. They're living out there, and they're struggling, and they're praying, keeping one another accountable, helping one another as brothers in the faith, brothers in Christ. And after 30 years, then St. Symeon had reached this great height of dispassion, which means that he was not he was not moved by the passions of the flesh. So he decided to go and to return to Edessa and to live there as a fool for Christ. And so he went back to Edessa and he feigned foolishness for Christ's sake, which means he did all sorts of crazy things. He was very holy. He was a miracle worker, but he didn't want glory for this, and so he pretended to be a madman so that nobody would, lift him up as a saint in the city. He didn't want that kind of recognition. He wanted the glory to go to God. So anyway, the one story in particular that I'm interested in, there were many of them, but the one story I'm interested in particular was one day when he was sleeping on the porch of this couple that had employed him, and he actually gave all their stuff away, and it's a different story, but he gave all their stuff away, and so he was sleeping on their porch because he didn't have anywhere else to go, and he decided that he wanted to burn incense with his prayers, and say his prayers. And so he didn't have a censer, and he didn't have any, charcoal for the incense. And so he reached his hand into their wood stove and took a coal in his hand, and then he sprinkled some incense on top of it. And he was burning it in his hand as he was saying his prayers. Well, the wife, the woman of the house, she opened the door and she saw him with this coal in his hand. And she began to scream and freak out. She was certain that he was burning himself terribly. And he pretended that he was burning himself, and he shook his hand and let the coal fall down onto his cloak, I think. And miraculously, of course, his hand wasn't burned, and neither was his cloak. So even his cloak had such grace that the Lord permitted it not to be burned by this charcoal from the wood stove. And of course, this is reminiscent of one of my favorite saints, Saint David of Thessaloniki, who censed the Emperor Justinian and his entire court with charcoal and incense in the palm of his hand, also without burning himself. So don't try this at home, children. This is not something that we do. This is not something that your parish priest will likely do. And this is not something that you should try or encourage your parents to try. It's something that very few saints have done. And one of those saints we celebrate today, Saint Symeon of Edessa, the Fool for Christ. Christ is in our midst. He is and ever shall be.